Look closely at the life you are living right now, the people you encounter, the opportunities that appear, the obstacles that seem to repeat themselves, the way certain patterns keep circling back as if guided by an invisible rhythm. At first glance, it all feels accidental, as though reality is something happening to you from the outside. Most people move through life with this quiet assumption, believing that circumstances are the author of their story and that the mind merely reacts to what the world presents. Yet there comes a moment when a deeper question begins to surface, a question that changes the direction of everything. What if the order is actually reversed? You may not have noticed it consciously, but your life has always been responding to something far more intimate than external conditions. Beneath the visible surface of events, there exists a subtle chamber of thought and belief where every experience first begins to take form. Long before something appears in the physical world, it exists quietly within the assumptions you carry about yourself, about others, and about the nature of reality itself. These assumptions do not always announce themselves loudly. Most of the time they move silently, shaping perception, guiding behavior, and influencing the countless small decisions that eventually crystallize into the events you call your life. The principle at the heart of this realization is known as the law of assumption. It is not a superstition, not a ritual, and not a system of wishful thinking. It is a simple but profound observation about the relationship between consciousness and experience. Whatever you consistently assume to be true begins to organize the world around you in ways that confirm that assumption. Your beliefs become the lens through which reality is interpreted, and over time the environment itself seems to rearrange in harmony with the story you carry inside. Consider how naturally this process already operates in your daily life. When a person believes the world is filled with competition and hostility, they begin to notice conflict everywhere they turn. The same conversation that might appear friendly to someone else is interpreted as a threat. Opportunities seem scarce. People appear selfish. Gradually, their experiences confirm what they already believed. Another person, moving through the same city, the same streets, and the same circumstances, may assume that life is generous and filled with unexpected possibilities. They notice kindness where others see indifference. They discover opportunities hidden in ordinary moments. The world they inhabit feels entirely different, though nothing visible about the environment itself has changed. What differs is the assumption carried quietly within the mind. This inner assumption is not merely a thought you repeat once or twice. It is the deeper emotional conviction about who you are and what you expect life to deliver. When you hold an idea about yourself with enough consistency, it begins to influence the tone of your voice, the way you move through space, the choices you make, and the subtle signals you transmit to the people around you. Without realizing it, you begin acting from the identity your assumption has created. The world then responds to that identity, reinforcing it again and again until it feels like undeniable reality. You can observe this pattern in the lives of people who believe success comes naturally to them. They do not necessarily work harder than everyone else, nor are they always more talented. Yet they carry an inner certainty that things tend to work out in their favor. That quiet assumption changes the way they approach challenges. Instead of hesitating, they move forward. Instead of interpreting obstacles as defeat, they interpret them as temporary adjustments. Over time, their confidence attracts opportunities, partnerships, and ideas that appear almost effortless from the outside. What looks like luck often begins as an assumption. The same mechanism works in the opposite direction as well. A person who assumes that life is difficult or unfair unknowingly reinforces that narrative through constant inner dialogue. Small inconveniences become proof that the world is against them. Delays feel like personal attacks. Even moments of success are interpreted as temporary exceptions rather than natural outcomes. Their assumption becomes a script that reality follows with surprising accuracy. Yet the law of assumption is not meant to be understood as a source of blame or guilt. It is not a harsh judgment about past experiences. Instead, it is an invitation to recognize the creative role your consciousness has always been playing. The moment you become aware of this principle, something remarkable begins to happen. You realize that the same power shaping your current circumstances can be directed toward entirely new outcomes. The shift does not begin with dramatic actions in the external world. It begins with a quiet change in how you relate to your own thoughts. Imagine what happens when the inner dialogue that once repeated limitation gradually transforms into a narrative of possibility. Instead of silently telling yourself that something is unlikely, you begin assuming that your efforts are guided toward meaningful results. Instead of identifying with past disappointments, you begin identifying with the version of yourself capable of growth, insight, and resilience. At first, this shift may feel subtle, almost invisible. The outer world may appear unchanged for a while, continuing to echo older assumptions that were planted long ago. Yet beneath the surface, a new pattern is forming. Just as seeds planted in the soil do not immediately appear above the ground, assumptions planted in consciousness require time to express themselves through circumstances. This is why the law of assumption asks for something deeper than momentary enthusiasm. It asks for a sustained alignment between your inner identity and the reality you wish to experience. When the assumption becomes natural, when it feels less like a performance and more like a quiet truth you carry within, reality begins responding in ways that often feel almost mysterious. You start noticing coincidences that seem strangely timely. Conversations unfold that open unexpected doors. Ideas appear with unusual clarity. What once felt distant gradually becomes familiar. None of this happens through force or struggle. It emerges from the invisible harmony between your inner state and the world that reflects it. In this sense, the law of assumption is less about controlling life and more about understanding the intimate connection between consciousness and experience. The outer world is not an enemy to conquer or a puzzle to manipulate. It is a mirror responding faithfully to the identity you inhabit within your own mind. Once you begin to see life through this lens, an entirely different relationship with reality becomes possible. Circumstances no longer appear as fixed verdicts about your future. They become signals pointing toward the assumptions that shape them. And when assumptions can be changed, so can the patterns that follow. There is a quiet kind of freedom hidden in that realization. A freedom that does not arrive with fanfare, but settles gently into awareness. It simply waits to be recognized, much like a truth that had been present all along, quietly shaping the path beneath your feet. Imagine discovering that something immensely powerful has been operating in your life for years, quietly influencing every experience you have ever had, yet remaining almost completely unnoticed, not because it was hidden from you, but because it was so close to your own mind that you rarely stopped to examine it. The law of assumption is not a mysterious force waiting somewhere outside you. It has always been woven into the ordinary rhythm of your thoughts, your expectations, and the silent conclusions you draw about what is possible for you. The surprising realization is not that this law exists, but that it has been guiding your reality all along, whether you were aware of it or not. Many people spend years believing that their lives are shaped primarily by circumstances. They point to the environment they were born into, the opportunities they received or lacked, the decisions of other people, or the unpredictable turns of fate. While these factors appear significant on the surface, they are only part of a deeper structure. Beneath every circumstance lies an assumption about how life works and who you are within it. These assumptions are often formed early, influenced by family, culture, and repeated experiences, and over time they become so familiar that they feel like unquestionable truths. Yet what you accept as truth becomes the blueprint from which your reality grows. The forgotten nature of this law is not accidental. Human beings tend to focus their attention on visible events rather than the invisible patterns that precede them. When something happens in your life, your instinct is to look outward for explanations. If an opportunity appears, you attribute it to luck or timing. If a setback occurs, you blame external obstacles. Rarely do people pause to examine the inner assumptions that quietly shape the conditions leading up to those events. The law of assumption invites you to reverse that perspective. Instead of asking why life happens to you, it asks you to consider how your inner convictions may be guiding what happens through you. Think about the countless small beliefs you carry throughout the day. Some are so subtle that you may barely notice them. Perhaps you assume that certain opportunities are meant for other people but not for you. Perhaps you believe that success requires endless struggle, or that meaningful relationships are difficult to maintain. Maybe you hold the quiet conviction that you must always prove your worth before you deserve recognition. Each of these assumptions operates like a silent instruction given to reality. Over time, they influence how you interpret situations, how you behave within them, and what outcomes you unconsciously expect. Life then unfolds in ways that appear to confirm those expectations. Yet the moment you become aware of this process, A remarkable possibility emerges. If assumptions shape reality, then the assumptions you consciously choose have the power to reshape the direction of your life. This does not mean pretending that challenges do not exist or forcing yourself to repeat empty affirmations. The transformation begins when you recognize that your inner narrative is not fixed. The beliefs you once accepted as permanent were simply habits of thought that became familiar through repetition. Like any habit, they can be replaced with new patterns that align with the reality you wish to experience. Awakening to the law of assumption often begins with a simple observation. The stories you tell yourself about life tend to become self-fulfilling. When someone repeatedly tells themselves that they are unlucky, they start noticing every event that reinforces that identity. When another person quietly believes that they are capable and resourceful, they approach challenges with a different mindset. Even before circumstances change, their behavior shifts. They take actions that reflect their belief in possibility rather than their fear of failure. Over time, the outcomes of these actions reinforce the assumption that inspired them. This awakening does not happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, like realizing that a language you have been speaking unconsciously can now be understood clearly. The first stage is simple awareness. You begin to notice the internal dialogue that runs quietly beneath your daily activities. You hear the assumptions hidden inside casual phrases, such as, "Things never work out for me," or "This is probably too difficult." Instead of accepting these thoughts automatically, you observe them as choices. Each assumption becomes visible, and once it becomes visible, it can be examined. From that moment forward, the power of chosen assumptions begins to take shape. You are no longer limited to repeating the beliefs that were handed to you by circumstance. You can begin selecting assumptions that reflect a different identity and a different future. This selection is not about denying reality, but about deciding which version of reality you are willing to cultivate within your own consciousness. Just as a gardener chooses which seeds to plant in fertile soil, you begin choosing which ideas about yourself deserve to grow. Consider what happens when a person deliberately adopts the assumption that life is responsive rather than hostile. Instead of expecting obstacles at every step, they start expecting solutions to appear. Their attention shifts toward possibilities that once seemed invisible. Conversations take on new meaning. Opportunities that might have been overlooked suddenly stand out. Even setbacks are interpreted differently, seen as temporary adjustments rather than final defeats. The outer world may look the same, but the experience of moving through it begins to change. This shift reveals one of the most profound aspects of the law of assumption. Reality does not simply reflect what you want. It reflects what you accept as true. Desire alone does not reshape circumstances unless it is accompanied by a deeper conviction that the desired outcome is possible and natural. When an assumption settles into your consciousness with quiet certainty, it begins influencing your thoughts, your emotional responses, and the countless decisions you make throughout the day. These small adjustments accumulate until the environment around you gradually mirrors the new identity you have embraced. Awakening to this law is not about gaining control over every event in life. It is about recognizing the partnership between consciousness and experience. Your assumptions provide the internal framework through which reality organizes itself. Once you see this relationship clearly, you no longer feel entirely at the mercy of external conditions. Instead, you begin to understand that the beliefs you carry about yourself and the world are participating in the creation of the life you are living. And when that understanding settles into your awareness, something subtle yet powerful begins to shift. The ordinary stream of thoughts that once passed unnoticed becomes a place of quiet choice, a place where the assumptions you nurture today gradually shape the experiences that will greet you tomorrow. Most people believe that the most important conversations in life happen with other people. They remember words spoken in meetings, arguments that changed relationships, advice given by teachers, parents, or friends. Yet the conversation that truly shapes the direction of your life rarely happens out loud. It unfolds quietly, continuously. In the private space of your own awareness, it is the voice that interprets every situation, the voice that decides what something means, the voice that repeats subtle conclusions about who you are and what kind of life you are living, long before the world responds to you. This inner voice has already described the story you are stepping into. You may notice how naturally this process unfolds in the smallest moments. Something unexpected happens during the day, and almost instantly a thought appears explaining it. A delay in traffic becomes evidence that the day is already going wrong. A simple compliment becomes a confirmation that perhaps things are finally improving. These interpretations arrive so quickly that they feel automatic. Yet they are quietly forming the narrative through which your experiences will be understood. The law of assumption does not wait for dramatic declarations. It operates through these everyday interpretations that repeat themselves until they become familiar truths. Think about the phrases people often carry in their minds without realizing it. Some quietly repeat the idea that life requires constant struggle, that opportunities are rare, or that success belongs to a select few. Others carry assumptions that life has a way of unfolding in their favor, that new possibilities appear when they remain open, or that unexpected help tends to arrive at the right moment. Neither person may speak these ideas aloud, yet the emotional tone behind those assumptions begins influencing how they move through the world. The first person approaches situations cautiously, expecting resistance. The second moves forward with curiosity, noticing possibilities where others see obstacles. Over time, their experiences begin to mirror the expectations they carry within. This is why inner dialogue matters far more than most people imagine. The words you speak internally are not isolated thoughts floating through your mind. They are subtle instructions guiding perception, behavior, and emotional response. When you repeatedly describe yourself as overwhelmed, life begins to feel heavier. When you assume that something will be difficult, your attention immediately focuses on every complication that confirms that belief. Gradually, the outer environment starts to appear as though it has been arranged to match the tone of your inner narrative. In truth, your interpretation of events has been shaping the entire experience from the beginning. Consider how easily this pattern can be observed in daily life. Two people encounter the same situation, yet their experiences differ dramatically. One sees possibility, the other sees limitation. One hears opportunity hidden inside a challenge. The other hears confirmation that things rarely work out. The event itself has not changed. What changes is the conversation taking place within the mind of each person. That inner dialogue acts like a filter, organizing the meaning of every moment. It determines whether an experience becomes encouragement or discouragement, whether a difficulty becomes a lesson or a reason to stop trying. What makes this principle so powerful is its constant presence. Your inner dialogue does not pause while you are distracted or resting. It continues quietly, shaping the emotional atmosphere in which you live. Even when you are not consciously thinking about your goals or your future, subtle assumptions remain active beneath the surface. They influence how you interpret conversations, how you react to opportunities, and how much confidence you bring into unfamiliar situations. Over weeks, months, and years, these quiet patterns accumulate until they form the recognizable structure of your life. Yet, the realization that your inner dialogue is shaping your experience is not meant to create pressure or self-criticism. It is meant to reveal the remarkable flexibility that has always existed within your mind. The narrative you carry about yourself is not fixed. It is not permanently attached to your identity. It is simply a story that has been repeated often enough to feel familiar. And just as a familiar story can be rewritten, the dialogue within your mind can gradually take on a new tone. This transformation does not require dramatic effort. It begins with awareness. The moment you start noticing the language you use internally, you create a small space between the thought and your acceptance of it. Instead of letting every assumption pass unquestioned, you begin observing which ideas truly deserve to shape your future. Some thoughts lose their influence the moment they are recognized as habits rather than truths. Others may quietly evolve into statements that reflect a more expansive understanding of what is possible for you. Imagine the difference between moving through the day with the quiet assumption that life tends to support your growth and moving through it with the expectation that every step will require struggle. The same tasks appear differently. Conversations feel different. Even challenges carry a different emotional weight. Over time, these subtle shifts in perception influence the choices you make, the energy you bring into your actions, and the opportunities you notice that once passed unnoticed. In this way, your inner dialogue becomes more than a stream of thoughts. It becomes a creative force guiding the direction of your experiences. The tone of that dialogue determines whether your attention searches for confirmation of limitation or confirmation of possibility. Each interpretation quietly plants seeds in the landscape of your future. Some of those seeds grow into discouragement, while others grow into confidence and clarity. The environment around you begins reflecting the pattern that has been cultivated within. The realization that your inner dialogue shapes your life does not require you to control every passing thought. Instead, it invites a gentler awareness of the story you are choosing to live inside. As you become more attentive to that narrative, the words you speak to yourself begin to carry a different kind of intention. They are no longer random reactions to circumstances. They become the quiet architecture of a life still unfolding, shaped moment by by the language you allow to take root within your own mind. Let me ask you to pause for a moment and notice something that has been happening inside you for as long as you can remember. Before any experience takes shape in the visible world, it is quietly rehearsed in another place within your imagination. Every plan you have ever made, every fear you have ever carried, every hope that has ever stirred inside you first appeared as an image, a possibility, or a scene in the theater of your mind, long before the outer world responded. The inner world was already alive with pictures, emotions, and silent expectations. You may have been taught that imagination is merely fantasy, a pleasant escape from reality, something useful for children but not particularly important for adults navigating the practical world. Yet the deeper truth is almost the opposite. Imagination is not an escape from reality, it is the workshop where reality is quietly assembled. What you repeatedly imagine begins to influence what you believe. What you believe begins to shape how you feel, and what you consistently feel becomes the atmosphere through which your actions and perceptions unfold. This chain imagination, belief, feeling forms the invisible architecture behind the experiences you eventually call your life. Think about how naturally belief develops through repetition. When an idea is entertained once, it may pass through the mind like a cloud. When the same idea is revisited again and again, it gradually gains weight. Over time, it settles deeper into consciousness until it begins to feel true, even if it started as a simple possibility. This is why imagination carries such creative power. When you vividly imagine a situation, your mind does not treat it as entirely separate from reality. The emotional center of your being begins responding to the imagined experience as though it were already unfolding. The feeling generated by that image quietly reinforces the belief that such an experience belongs within your life. You can observe this process in everyday moments. Imagine someone preparing for an important conversation. If they repeatedly picture the conversation going badly, their body begins reacting to that imagined outcome. Their shoulders tense. Their voice becomes uncertain. By the time the real conversation takes place, their emotional state has already been shaped by what they imagined beforehand. On the other hand, if the same person imagines the conversation unfolding smoothly, they approach the situation with greater calm and clarity. The difference in imagination alters the feeling they carry into the moment, and that feeling influences how the event unfolds. This is why feeling plays such a crucial role in manifestation. Feeling is not merely an emotional reaction to events that have already occurred. It is the bridge that connects imagination to belief. When you imagine something vividly enough to feel it as though it were already real, you begin aligning your inner state with the experience you desire. Your nervous system responds. Your attention shifts. Your behavior subtly adjusts to reflect the reality your mind has accepted as possible. Many people attempt to change their lives by focusing exclusively on external action. They set goals, design plans, and work tirelessly toward outcomes they hope to achieve. While action certainly plays an important role, it becomes far more effective when it is supported by a corresponding inner assumption. Without that inner alignment, action often feels forced, heavy, or uncertain. When belief and feeling move in harmony with your intention, your actions begin to flow with greater ease. Decisions feel clearer. Opportunities appear more visible. The same effort produces different results because the emotional foundation beneath it has changed. What makes imagination so remarkable is that it allows you to experience a new identity before the physical world has fully caught up. Within imagination, you can step into the version of yourself that already lives the reality you desire. You can feel the calm confidence of someone who has achieved a goal, the gratitude of someone whose life is unfolding beautifully, the sense of peace that comes from knowing that things are working out in ways you once only hoped for. When these feelings become familiar within your inner world, they begin influencing the way you carry yourself through everyday situations. This is not about pretending that challenges do not exist. It is about recognizing that your emotional state shapes how you encounter those challenges. A person who imagines success and feels aligned with that possibility approaches obstacles with curiosity and resilience. A person who imagines failure often encounters the same obstacles with hesitation and doubt. The external challenge may be identical, but the internal response transforms the entire experience. Belief, therefore, is not something that must be forced. It grows naturally when imagination and feeling work together consistently. When you repeatedly imagine a possibility and allow yourself to feel the emotional reality of that possibility, belief gradually emerges as a quiet certainty. It does not need constant reinforcement because it begins to feel natural. At that point, your mind no longer treats the desired outcome as distant or unlikely. It becomes part of your identity. As this shift occurs, the relationship between your inner world and the outer world begins to change. Instead of waiting for circumstances to create feelings of confidence or joy, those feelings originate within you first. They become the atmosphere through which you experience the day. People often notice that when they adopt this inner alignment, the environment around them starts responding differently. Conversations feel more fluid. Creative ideas appear unexpectedly. Situations that once felt complicated begin resolving themselves in ways that seem almost effortless. None of this requires dramatic control over life's events. The process is quieter than that. It simply asks you to recognize the creative partnership between imagination, belief, and feeling. Together, they form a subtle but powerful current flowing beneath every experience you have. The images you entertain shape the beliefs you hold. The beliefs you hold influence the feelings you carry, and those feelings quietly guide the direction of your actions and perceptions. Once you begin to see this pattern clearly, imagination no longer appears as a passive daydream drifting through your mind. It becomes a tool through which you explore the possibilities of who you are becoming. Belief becomes the foundation that stabilizes those possibilities. Feeling becomes the living energy that breathes life into them, and together they move gently through your consciousness, shaping the experiences that gradually emerge in the world around you. Look at the people around you for a moment. The colleagues you work with, the strangers you meet during the day, the family members who know you best, even the brief encounters with someone who crosses your path for only a few minutes. At first, it may seem that each of these individuals acts entirely on their own impulses, independent of your thoughts or expectations. Yet if you observe your experiences closely over time, a curious pattern begins to reveal itself. The attitudes you expect from others often appear again and again, almost as if the world is quietly reflecting the assumptions you carry about how people will respond to you. This idea can feel surprising when you first encounter it, because it challenges the ordinary way we interpret human interaction. Most people believe relationships are shaped primarily by the personalities of others. If someone is kind, we assume kindness belongs entirely to them. If someone behaves coldly or dismissively, we conclude that this behavior is simply their nature. Yet, the law of assumption invites you to look deeper. It suggests that your expectations about others influence the subtle emotional atmosphere in which your interactions unfold. Those expectations are rarely spoken aloud, yet they influence tone, posture, facial expression, and the countless small signals that guide how people respond to one another. Imagine how two different assumptions can transform the same interaction. If you quietly believe that people tend to appreciate your presence, you move through conversations with a certain ease. Your attention remains open. Your voice carries warmth. You interpret ambiguous reactions generously rather than defensively. In response, people often relax around you, sensing the calm confidence you project. The conversation flows naturally because your expectation created a welcoming environment before a single word was spoken. Now imagine approaching the same situation with the quiet assumption that others are likely to judge or reject you, even if you never say those words out loud. The emotional tone behind that assumption begins shaping your behavior. You may speak cautiously, searching for signs of criticism. Your body language becomes slightly guarded. You interpret neutral expressions as possible disapproval. The other person senses this tension and may respond with distance or uncertainty. What began as an internal expectation gradually transforms into an external experience that appears to confirm your belief. This reflective quality of reality extends beyond brief conversations. Over time, the assumptions you carry about relationships begin shaping the types of connections that appear in your life. Someone who believes that trust is rare may unknowingly attract situations that reinforce caution and distance. Another person who assumes that meaningful relationships are possible approaches others with openness and patience, creating conditions where deeper connections can develop. The world does not simply deliver random encounters. It often mirrors the emotional expectations through which those encounters are interpreted. The same principle applies to circumstances beyond relationships. Consider how your assumptions about work, opportunity, or personal growth influence the situations you notice and the choices you make. A person who quietly assumes that their efforts lead to progress tends to approach challenges with curiosity rather than hesitation. When obstacles appear, they interpret them as temporary steps rather than permanent barriers. This mindset encourages persistence and creativity, which in turn increases the likelihood of meaningful results. Another person may carry the assumption that success is reserved for others or that effort rarely leads to reward. With that expectation guiding their perception, opportunities appear less visible. Even promising situations may be dismissed quickly because they do not match the story already playing within the mind. Over time, the environment begins reflecting the assumption that little can change. The difference between these two experiences is not merely external circumstance. It is the internal lens through which circumstance is interpreted and approached. This does not mean that the world revolves around your thoughts in a simplistic way, nor does it imply that every event can be traced directly to a single belief. Life remains complex, influenced by countless interactions and factors beyond immediate awareness. Yet the law of assumption reveals a consistent pattern. The meaning you assign to events and the expectations you carry into situations influence how reality organizes itself around you. The outer world becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting back the emotional identity you inhabit internally. Understanding this reflective relationship changes how you respond to difficulties. When something challenging appears in your life, the instinctive reaction is often to resist or blame the external situation. The mirror principle invites a different kind of reflection. Instead of asking only why something happened, you begin exploring the assumptions that may have shaped your interpretation of the experience. This shift does not involve self-criticism. It is simply a recognition that the inner narrative you carry has been participating in the creation of your environment. Once you recognize the world as a mirror, relationships take on new meaning. Instead of viewing others solely as sources of approval or conflict, you begin noticing how your expectations influence the dynamics between you. When you approach someone with genuine respect and curiosity, the conversation often unfolds differently than when you approach with suspicion or impatience. Small changes in your internal attitude ripple outward, altering the emotional tone of the interaction. Over time, this awareness encourages a more intentional relationship with your own assumptions. If the world reflects the identity you carry within, then cultivating a sense of confidence, kindness, and openness becomes more than a personal preference. It becomes a creative act, shaping the quality of your experiences. The assumptions you nurture internally begin echoing through your conversations, your opportunities, and the environments you inhabit. This perspective gradually transforms the way you move through daily life. Instead of feeling entirely shaped by circumstances, you begin recognizing the quiet dialogue between your inner state and the world around you. Each interaction becomes part of that dialogue. Each situation offers a reflection of the assumptions you carry about yourself and about others. And as you observe this mirror more closely, you start to notice how even subtle shifts in expectation can gently change the patterns appearing in the world that surrounds you. There comes a moment in your life when a quiet but profound realization begins to surface. The assumptions you hold about yourself are not merely descriptions of who you are, they are instructions guiding who you become. For years, perhaps without noticing it, you may have been carrying identities formed through past experiences, other people's opinions, or moments of disappointment that slowly hardened into conclusions. You may have quietly told yourself that you are the person who struggles, the person who is overlooked, the person who must always prove something before deserving peace or success. These assumptions, repeated often enough, begin shaping the way you see the world and the way the world responds to you. But the law of assumption offers something extraordinary. It reveals that identity itself is not fixed. The version of yourself you have been living as is simply the identity you have assumed long enough to believe. And if an identity can be assumed unconsciously, it can also be assumed deliberately. This is where transformation begins, not by fighting your circumstances, not by forcing life to change, but by quietly shifting the identity from which you live. You see, everything in your life organizes itself around who you believe you are. A person who assumes they are unworthy moves through opportunities with hesitation. Compliments feel uncomfortable. Success feels temporary. Even when good things happen, they may feel fragile, as though they could disappear at any moment. On the other hand, someone who assumes they are naturally capable approaches the same situations with a different energy. They do not necessarily possess more talent or better circumstances. What they carry is a quiet inner permission to exist as someone who belongs in the reality they desire. When you begin to understand this, healing becomes possible in a completely new way. Many people try to heal by endlessly analyzing past experiences, revisiting old wounds again and again in search of explanation. While reflection has its place, true transformation often begins elsewhere. It begins when you decide that your past experiences do not have the authority to define your present identity. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" you begin asking a different question. Who am I choosing to be now? This shift may seem subtle, yet it carries immense power. The moment you adopt a new assumption about yourself, your inner world begins reorganizing around that idea. Imagine someone who has always believed they are emotionally fragile. That belief influences how they interpret challenges, how they approach relationships, and how they respond to stress. But if that same person gradually assumes that they are resilient, that they possess the ability to grow stronger through experience, the emotional tone of their life begins to change. Situations that once felt overwhelming start appearing manageable. Confidence slowly replaces hesitation. This is the healing power of transformative assumption. It does not erase the past. It releases the past from its role as the architect of your future. Now let me speak directly to you for a moment. You may have spent years defining yourself through limitations that once felt very real. Perhaps you assumed that you must always struggle financially. Perhaps you believed that love is difficult to sustain. Perhaps you carried the quiet idea that happiness belongs to others more than it belongs to you. But these ideas are not permanent truths. They are simply assumptions repeated often enough to feel familiar. And familiarity is not the same as destiny. When you consciously assume a new identity, something subtle but powerful begins happening inside you. Instead of waiting for life to prove your worth, you begin living as though that worth already exists. Instead of chasing fulfillment somewhere in the future, you start embodying the emotional state of fulfillment now. This does not mean pretending that every circumstance has already changed. It means allowing your inner state to reflect the version of yourself who knows that change is natural and inevitable. Living from fulfillment is one of the most transformative shifts a person can make. Many people believe fulfillment must arrive after success, after achievement, after life finally aligns with their expectations. Yet the law of assumption reveals the reverse order. Fulfillment is the state that attracts experiences aligned with it. When you feel internally complete, you move through the world with a calm certainty that does not depend on external validation. Decisions become clearer. Creativity flows more easily. Opportunities appear less threatening and more inviting. What makes this state so powerful is that it changes how you relate to life itself. Instead of constantly measuring what is missing, you begin noticing what is already present. Gratitude replaces quiet dissatisfaction. Confidence replaces subtle self-doubt. And because your perception changes, the world you experience begins reflecting that change in surprising ways. Relationships become more harmonious because you are no longer seeking approval. Work becomes more meaningful because you approach it from a place of creative contribution rather than anxious proving. Even challenges feel different because they are no longer interpreted as evidence of inadequacy. They simply become part of the unfolding process of growth. This transformation rarely happens overnight. Assumptions that have been repeated for years may take time to dissolve. Yet every moment you choose to see yourself differently, every time you return to the identity you wish to embody, the new assumption grows stronger. Gradually it becomes less of an effort and more of a natural state. Eventually you reach a point where the identity you once practiced begins to feel like the most authentic version of yourself. The confidence that once felt unfamiliar becomes comfortable. The sense of peace that once felt distant becomes part of your daily awareness. And the fulfillment you once imagined as a future destination quietly becomes the atmosphere in which you live. When that shift occurs, life no longer feels like something you are constantly trying to repair or improve. Instead, It begins unfolding from a place of inner alignment, where the person you believe yourself to be and the life you experience gradually move into harmony with one another. Have you ever noticed how a single sentence inside your mind can quietly determine the direction of an entire day? Not something you say aloud, not a speech you prepare for others, but that private phrase that slips through your thoughts almost unnoticed. You wake up, something small happens, and immediately a conclusion forms within you. Today will probably be difficult, or perhaps things might actually work out. The words are simple, yet from that moment forward, the day begins to move under the influence of that inner declaration. You may not realize it while it is happening, but the mind treats those inner words with unusual seriousness. What you repeat internally becomes something like a personal law, not a rule written in books, not a command imposed from the outside, but a principle quietly accepted by your own consciousness. Once a statement settles into that place of acceptance, your perception, your emotional reactions, and even your decisions begin organizing themselves around it. Let me bring this closer to you. Suppose a person carries the silent sentence, "Life is always harder for me than it is for others." They may not say it often, yet it exists somewhere in their inner dialogue. When something unexpected happens, that sentence rises instantly. A delay becomes confirmation. A challenge becomes proof. Even neutral situations begin appearing as evidence that the belief must be true. Gradually, the person feels surrounded by the very pattern they have been declaring internally. Now imagine another inner sentence living quietly in someone's mind. "Life has a way of opening paths for me." Notice how different that feels. The same world exists around them. The same uncertainties appear, yet the interpretation of events begins to change. A difficulty becomes something to navigate rather than something to fear. A delay becomes an opportunity to adjust. Possibilities appear more visible, simply because the mind expects them to exist. The outer world has not changed. The inner word has. This is why Neville Goddard often spoke about the power of the word within. Long before circumstances take shape, the inner language you carry begins guiding the emotional atmosphere of your life. Every desire that appears inside you must eventually pass through this inner language before it can become experience. Desire itself is not the problem. In fact, desire is one of the most natural signals that something new wants to emerge in your life. You desire growth because something within you recognizes the possibility of expansion. You desire peace because a deeper part of you knows that peace belongs to your nature. You desire abundance because consciousness itself is creative and expressive. Yet the moment desire appears, another voice often rises beside it. The inner commentary begins. "That might be too difficult. Maybe later. People like me don't usually reach that kind of life." These sentences seem harmless, but they quietly interrupt the bridge between desire and manifestation. Desire points toward a new direction. The inner word either builds the bridge toward that direction or quietly dismantles it. Now listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, because this is where everything begins to change for you. The bridge between desire and reality is not built by force. It is built by alignment. The moment your inner word begins speaking from the perspective of the fulfilled version of you, the entire emotional structure of your life starts shifting. Instead of saying, "I hope this happens someday," the inner voice becomes calmer, more grounded. It carries the tone of quiet recognition. "This belongs to my path." Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just a subtle certainty that the life you are imagining is not separate from you. When the inner word changes in that way, something inside you relaxes. You stop treating your desire like a distant dream. It becomes something closer, something already woven into your identity. From that state, your thoughts change, your emotional reactions soften. You begin noticing opportunities that previously escaped your attention. Even your actions begin moving differently. You speak with a little more calm. You approach situations with curiosity instead of hesitation. You respond to setbacks without immediately assuming failure. None of these changes require intense effort. They simply grow out of the internal language you have begun accepting as true. Now here is something fascinating that many people overlook. The mind does not respond strongly to words spoken occasionally. It responds to words that are repeated with feeling and familiarity. The sentences you return to again and again slowly become part of your identity. Once they reach that level, they operate almost automatically. You no longer have to force them. They simply guide your perception of the world. That is why the inner word acts like a law. It establishes the emotional environment through which your experiences unfold. And once that environment stabilizes, reality begins reflecting it with surprising consistency. This does not mean life becomes perfect or free of challenges, but the way challenges appear begins changing. Situations that once seemed overwhelming become manageable. Opportunities that once felt distant begin appearing within reach. What used to feel like coincidence begins looking more like alignment. Gradually, something remarkable happens. The distance between what you desire and what you experience becomes smaller. The imagined life stops feeling imaginary. The identity you once practiced internally becomes the person you naturally move as. And all of it begins with something incredibly simple: the words you quietly accept inside your own mind. So pay attention to the language you live within. Notice the tone of the sentences you repeat when no one else is listening, because those words are not merely thoughts passing through your awareness. They are the quiet architecture of the bridge you are building every day, one that slowly connects the life you imagine with the life that begins unfolding around you. There is a subtle difference between hoping for something and knowing something within yourself, and that difference quietly changes the entire direction of a person's life. Many people move through the world with the language of hope. They say, "I hope things improve," or "Maybe one day my situation will change." Hope may sound positive, but hidden inside it is uncertainty. It places the fulfillment of your desire somewhere far ahead of you, somewhere outside your present identity. It suggests that life might change later, if circumstances cooperate, but the principle Neville Goddard spoke about invites you into a completely different posture of mind. Instead of hoping that life will change, you begin speaking inwardly from the position that the change has already occurred, not as an act of pretending, and certainly not as a denial of present circumstances, but as a deliberate alignment with the reality you have chosen to embody. The difference is quiet but powerful. Hope waits. Certainty moves. Let me speak directly to you here. When you think about the life you desire, what language does your inner voice use? Does it say, "Maybe this could happen"? Or does it speak with a calm recognition that this direction already belongs to your life? That internal tone matters more than most people realize. The mind responds very differently to a possibility than it does to a conclusion. When you treat your desire as a distant possibility, the emotional energy behind it remains weak and uncertain. But when you allow your inner voice to speak as though the fulfillment is already established, your entire emotional state begins reorganizing around that assumption. This does not require dramatic declarations. In fact, the most powerful inner statements are often simple and natural. Instead of repeating desperate affirmations, you begin carrying the quiet sentence that someone fulfilled might naturally think. Imagine the difference between saying, "I hope I can succeed," and saying, "My life is unfolding in the direction of success." One statement reaches forward anxiously. The other rests in a calm expectation that the process is already underway. Now notice what happens inside you when that tone changes. Your body relaxes slightly. Your thoughts become less scattered. The mind stops searching frantically for proof and begins moving with quiet trust. That emotional shift is not imaginary. It influences how you respond to every situation throughout the day. When someone lives with the assumption that their life is already moving toward fulfillment, they carry a different presence into the world. They speak differently. They make decisions differently. Even their posture communicates a subtle confidence that others can feel. This is what it means to live as though it is already done. Many people misunderstand this idea and assume it requires ignoring reality. But the principle is far more grounded than that. Living as though it is done does not mean pretending the current moment is perfect. It means allowing your identity to reflect the version of yourself who already knows the direction of their life. The difference is internal. Instead of reacting to life from the identity of someone still searching, you respond from the identity of someone who has already found their path. Consider how a person behaves once a goal has been achieved. They no longer speak about it with uncertainty. They no longer question whether it is possible. The outcome has become part of their personal history. The emotional tension surrounding it disappears. Now imagine carrying that same emotional certainty before the external result has fully appeared. When you live from that inner state, your actions naturally align with the reality you have accepted internally. For example, someone who assumes their life is moving toward abundance begins making decisions from a place of confidence rather than fear. They invest energy in opportunities instead of hesitating at every risk. Someone who assumes their relationships are guided by respect and harmony approaches others with patience and openness. Their interactions carry less defensiveness, which often encourages the same attitude in return. The outer behavior changes because the inner identity has already shifted. This process also transforms the way you experience time. When a desire feels distant, every delay seems frustrating. You measure progress constantly, wondering why results have not appeared yet. But when you live from the assumption that your fulfillment already belongs to you, time begins to feel different. The journey toward that outcome becomes part of the experience rather than an obstacle. You move through the present moment with greater calm because the destination no longer feels uncertain. That calm state has an interesting effect on your awareness. When anxiety disappears, your mind becomes more attentive. You begin noticing opportunities that once seemed invisible. Ideas arrive more easily. Conversations open unexpected doors. From the outside, it may look as though life suddenly began cooperating with you. In reality, the cooperation started the moment your inner state aligned with the reality you had chosen. Now let me return your attention to something very simple but very important. The language you use inside your mind shapes the emotional environment in which your life unfolds. When your inner voice speaks with hesitation, that hesitation spreads into your actions. When your inner voice speaks with certainty, that certainty gradually becomes visible in the way you move through the world. You do not need to control every thought that appears in your mind. That would be exhausting and unnecessary. What matters is the direction you consistently return to. When doubt appears, you gently return to the assumption you have chosen. When uncertainty arises, you remind yourself of the identity you are practicing. Over time, the chosen assumption becomes familiar, and what once felt like a deliberate effort becomes a natural state. Eventually, something subtle happens. The life you imagine begins appearing around you in ways that feel almost ordinary. What once seemed extraordinary becomes part of your daily experience. And when that moment arrives, you may look back and realize that the transformation did not begin in the outer world at all. It began the moment you stopped speaking about your future as a possibility and started living your life from the quiet certainty that the path ahead was already unfolding beneath your feet. Let me ask you something very simple, and I want you to answer it honestly inside yourself. When a new opportunity appears in your life, something unfamiliar, something that could change your direction, what is the first sentence that quietly forms in your mind? Not the polite answer you might give someone else, but the private thought that appears before you have time to filter it. Does it say, "This might actually work"? Or does it whisper, "People like me usually don't get chances like that"? That first sentence is rarely random. It carries the weight of years of repetition, years of conclusions slowly absorbed from the world around you. And here is something that surprises many people when they begin examining their own inner dialogue. A large portion of the beliefs guiding their lives were never consciously chosen. They were inherited. You inherited them from the environments that raised you. You inherited them from the fears of people who lived before you. You inherited them from conversations repeated so often that they eventually sounded like facts. A child does not question the beliefs spoken around them. A child simply listens. When adults say, "Life is dangerous," the child absorbs caution. When adults say money is scarce, the child absorbs scarcity. When adults say success belongs to a few lucky individuals, the child absorbs limitation. None of this happens intentionally. It happens quietly, through repetition. The mind hears an idea often enough, and eventually the idea becomes part of the inner voice. By the time you reach adulthood, that voice feels like your own thinking. But here is the deeper truth I want you to see. The voice in your mind may sound like you, yet much of what it says was written long before you began consciously choosing your direction in life. Think about how this plays out in ordinary moments. Someone presents you with a possibility, a new project, a relationship, a change in direction. Before you even analyze the situation, a quiet conclusion appears. This probably won't last. Or, this is too big for me. The thought feels natural because it has been repeated for years. But the moment you step back and look at it carefully, you may realize that the sentence did not originate from your own understanding of life. It was borrowed, and borrowed beliefs have a strange power over people, because they were never consciously chosen. They are rarely consciously challenged. They operate automatically, like old scripts replaying in the background of the mind. The person may sincerely want a new life, yet their internal dialogue continues, repeating conclusions formed decades earlier. This is why transformation begins with something very simple: noticing the conversation inside your mind. You do not have to attack your old beliefs. You do not have to force them away. You simply begin observing them. At first, you may be surprised by how often the same phrases appear. Perhaps you notice the mind saying, "Things usually don't work out." Perhaps you hear the quiet assumption that success requires exhausting struggle. Maybe you realize you have been carrying the belief that happiness must always be temporary. These sentences may have followed you for years without ever being questioned, but the moment you notice them, something changes. A belief that is seen clearly loses part of its automatic authority. Instead of accepting it immediately, you begin recognizing it as a pattern, and patterns can be rewritten. Now let me explain something important to you, because this is where many people misunderstand the process. Rewriting the inner conversation is not about pretending your old thoughts never existed. It is about choosing which thoughts deserve to guide your future. When an inherited belief appears, you no longer treat it as the final word. You treat it as an old echo. For example, imagine a thought arises saying, "Opportunities like this are not meant for me." In the past, that sentence might have ended the conversation. Now something new happens. Another voice inside you begins responding, not aggressively, not with force, but with calm awareness. That idea belongs to the past. My life is expanding in ways I am learning to trust. Notice the difference here. You are not fighting the old belief. You are introducing a new direction for the conversation, and conversations change gradually. The first time you challenge an inherited belief, it may feel unfamiliar. The second time, it becomes easier. Over time, the mind begins recognizing that the old sentence is no longer the dominant narrative. The new language starts appearing more often. This is how the inner dialogue evolves. Where you once heard certainty about limitation, you begin hearing openness about possibility. Where the mind once predicted disappointment, it begins considering different outcomes. Where identity once felt fixed, it begins feeling flexible. And this shift does not stay confined to the mind. Your behavior begins changing in small ways. You approach conversations differently. You remain present with opportunities instead of dismissing them quickly. You allow experiences to unfold before deciding their meaning. Gradually, the world begins responding to this new openness. The most interesting part of this process is how quietly it unfolds. There is rarely a dramatic moment when everything suddenly changes. Instead, the inner conversation slowly takes on a different tone. The voice that once repeated inherited fears becomes less convincing. The voice that reflects your chosen direction becomes stronger. Eventually, you reach a point where the beliefs you consciously selected begin feeling more natural than the ones you inherited. You no longer react automatically to the old scripts. You begin responding from a new identity. And one day you may notice something subtle but powerful. The sentences guiding your life no longer sound like echoes from the past. They sound like the voice of someone who has finally realized that the story unfolding inside their mind is not something they were forced to accept. It is something they are free to write. Let me invite you to look at something most people overlook every day. Not the world outside you, not the events unfolding around you, but the quiet image you carry of yourself when no one else is watching. Somewhere inside your mind, there exists a picture of who you believe you are. You may not consciously describe it in words, yet it influences everything you do. It determines how confidently you walk into a room, how you respond to opportunities, how you interpret success and failure, and even how comfortable you feel receiving good things from life. That inner picture, your self-image, is one of the most powerful forces shaping your reality. Most people assume their self-image is simply the result of past experiences. They believe they see themselves a certain way because life has already proven that identity to be true. If someone has faced repeated difficulty, they may quietly conclude that struggle is part of who they are. If someone has been overlooked or criticized, they may carry the subtle belief that they are somehow less capable than others. Over time, these impressions become so familiar that the person stops questioning them. The self-image becomes the lens through which every new experience is interpreted. But here is the deeper truth that changes everything. Your self-image is not a permanent record of your past. It is a living idea that can evolve the moment you begin seeing yourself differently. Think about how easily imagination influences your emotional state. If you close your eyes and imagine standing confidently before a group of people, your body begins responding to that image. Your breathing changes. Your posture shifts. Your mind becomes more focused. Even though the situation is imaginary, your nervous system reacts as though something real is happening. This is because the mind does not draw a sharp line between vivid inner vision and external experience. What you consistently picture about yourself gradually becomes part of your psychological identity. Now consider what happens when a person repeatedly imagines themselves as someone limited or incapable. That inner vision quietly shapes their behavior. They hesitate before speaking. They underestimate their ideas. They step away from opportunities that might reveal their potential. Over time, the outer world seems to confirm the identity they have been imagining internally. Yet the confirmation came not because the identity was fixed, but because the person continued reinforcing the same inner picture. The same principle works in the opposite direction. When you begin cultivating a new self-image, one aligned with confidence, clarity, and fulfillment, the mind gradually reorganizes around that vision. Instead of reacting to life as the person you used to believe you were, you start responding as the person you are becoming. This shift does not require pretending the past never happened. It simply requires recognizing that the past does not have exclusive authority over your future identity. Let me speak directly to you for a moment. The life you experience is deeply connected to the way you see yourself within it. If you carry the quiet assumption that you are someone who must always struggle for recognition, your behavior will unconsciously support that belief. But if you begin seeing yourself as someone capable of growth, someone whose ideas deserve space in the world, your actions start reflecting that understanding. The difference may seem subtle at first, yet over time it transforms the direction of your life. This is where inner vision becomes important. Inner vision is not daydreaming in the sense people usually imagine. It is the deliberate act of seeing beyond the appearances of the present moment. When circumstances seem limited, inner vision allows you to imagine the person you are becoming beyond those limitations. You begin picturing yourself moving through life with the qualities you wish to embody: calm, confidence, creativity, resilience, generosity, or wisdom. The mind responds strongly to images that carry emotional meaning. When you repeatedly return to the vision of yourself living from fulfillment, that image slowly becomes familiar. Familiarity turns into belief. Belief influences behavior. Behavior changes outcomes. What began as imagination eventually becomes lived experience. Another important aspect of inner vision is learning to see beyond temporary appearances. Life often presents moments that seem discouraging or confusing. When a situation does not immediately match your expectations, it is easy to conclude that your path is blocked. Yet the law of assumption encourages you to interpret appearances differently. Instead of accepting every temporary condition as permanent truth, you hold your vision steady while circumstances continue evolving. Think of a sculptor working with stone. At first, the stone appears rough and unfinished. Someone unfamiliar with the process might assume the stone will remain that way. But the sculptor already sees the finished form within it. Each movement of the chisel gradually reveals the image that existed in the artist's mind long before it became visible to others. Your self-image works in a similar way. The person you are becoming may not yet be fully visible in the outer world. Yet the moment you begin seeing that identity clearly within your own mind, the process of shaping reality has already begun. When challenges appear, the old self-image may attempt to return. It might whisper familiar doubts or remind you of past limitations. But now you understand something you did not fully recognize before. Those thoughts are not permanent definitions of who you are. They are echoes of an earlier identity that no longer needs to guide your life. Each time you return to your chosen vision of yourself, you strengthen it. Each time you act from that vision rather than from old assumptions, the new identity becomes more natural. Gradually, the inner picture begins expressing itself through your words, your decisions, and your presence. Eventually, the world around you starts reflecting the change. People respond differently because your confidence has changed. Opportunities appear because your perception has expanded. Situations that once felt intimidating begin feeling manageable because the identity facing them is no longer the same one. And somewhere along this quiet journey, the person you once imagined becoming stops feeling like an idea in your mind. It begins feeling like the most natural version of yourself, the one that had been waiting patiently behind old assumptions, ready to emerge the moment you started seeing beyond appearances and recognizing who you truly have the freedom to be. There is a question many people quietly carry inside themselves. What do I do with the past? Not the version of the past that appears in photographs or calendars, but the emotional past that continues living inside memory. Moments that seemed embarrassing, decisions that feel like mistakes, opportunities that slipped away, conversations that ended differently than you wished they had. For many people, these memories become fixed points in the story they tell about themselves. They treat them like permanent evidence, proof of what kind of life they are destined to live. Yet the deeper work of consciousness asks you to see something different about the past. The events themselves may be finished, but the meaning you attach to them is still alive. Every time you remember an experience, you are not simply observing it from a distance. You are re-experiencing it through the emotional interpretation you carry today. In other words, the past is not just something that happened, it is something your mind continues rehearsing through memory. This is where the idea of revision enters the practice Neville Goddard described. Revision does not mean pretending an event never occurred. It means releasing the emotional authority the old interpretation holds over your present identity. Instead of replaying a memory exactly as it happened, you allow your imagination to reshape the meaning of that moment so it no longer reinforces limitation. Let me explain this in a way that speaks directly to you. Imagine remembering a conversation where you felt misunderstood. Perhaps someone dismissed your idea or reacted coldly. And since that day, you have carried the quiet belief that your voice does not matter as much as you hoped it would. Each time the memory returns, the feeling returns with it. Without realizing it, the memory strengthens an identity of hesitation. Now imagine approaching that same memory with awareness. Instead of replaying the scene exactly as it unfolded, you gently allow the moment to evolve in your imagination. You see yourself speaking with calm clarity. You imagine the other person listening with interest, responding with respect, perhaps even appreciation. The emotional tone changes. Instead of reinforcing the old identity, the memory now supports the identity you are choosing to embody. At first, this may seem like a small mental exercise, but its effect is deeper than it appears. The mind responds strongly to emotionally vivid images, whether they come from external events or from imagination. When you revise a memory and experience it with a new emotional tone, your nervous system begins releasing the tension connected to the old interpretation. The past stops acting as a silent argument against your future. Revision, then, becomes a way of reclaiming authority over your inner world. Many people unknowingly carry a collection of memories that quietly shape their expectations. A failed attempt becomes proof that success is unlikely. A painful relationship becomes evidence that love leads to disappointment. These conclusions settle into the inner conversation and influence how new situations are approached. By revising the emotional meaning of those memories, you interrupt the cycle that keeps repeating the same patterns. But revision alone is not the entire practice. It works alongside something equally important, practicing the state of being. Most people try to change their lives by focusing only on actions. They work harder, plan more carefully, or search for new strategies. While these efforts can be valuable, they often overlook the inner state from which those actions emerge. The state of being refers to the emotional identity you inhabit while moving through life. It is the atmosphere of consciousness that shapes how you perceive the world. When someone lives in the state of frustration, even small inconveniences feel overwhelming. When someone lives in the state of confidence, the same challenges appear manageable. The external circumstances may be identical, yet the inner state transforms the experience. Practicing a state of being means intentionally returning to the emotional identity aligned with the life you are creating. Instead of waiting for circumstances to produce confidence, you begin cultivating confidence internally. Instead of waiting for the world to provide peace, you practice inhabiting the feeling of peace within your own awareness. Let me bring this closer to your daily life. Suppose you desire a life filled with creative fulfillment. Practicing the state of being does not mean waiting until success arrives before you allow yourself to feel inspired. It means moving through the present moment with the emotional posture of someone already living creatively curious, attentive, open to ideas. Your behavior gradually aligns with that identity because the state is already active within you. This practice is not rigid or forced. It becomes easier when approached gently. Throughout the day, you simply notice the emotional tone you are carrying. When the mind drifts into old patterns of doubt or limitation, you remind yourself of the identity you are cultivating. You return to the state that reflects your chosen direction. Over time, this state becomes familiar, just as earlier identities once did. What makes this combination of revision and state practice so powerful is that it gradually dissolves the separation between past and future. Old memories lose their ability to define who you are today, while the emotional identity of your future begins expressing itself in the present moment. Eventually, something subtle happens. The past stops feeling like a weight you must carry forward. Instead, it becomes simply a series of experiences that helped you discover the kind of life you now choose to live, and the future stops feeling distant, because the state associated with it is already part of your daily awareness. From that point onward, life no longer feels like a struggle to escape what has already happened. It becomes a continuous unfolding of the identity you practice each day, the quiet state of being from which your experiences naturally begin to grow. Look carefully at how most people live their days. They move through the present moment as if it were merely a waiting room for the future. Their attention is always somewhere ahead of them on the result they want, the problem they hope will disappear, the moment when life will finally feel complete. Because of that, the present rarely feels satisfying. It feels like a delay, something to endure until the real life arrives later. But the deeper practice Neville Goddard described turns that entire way of living upside down. The moment you truly assume the reality of your desire within consciousness, something very important must follow: rest. Not physical rest alone, but psychological rest. The mind stops arguing with the outcome. The inner debate quiets. You are no longer chasing the fulfillment, because inwardly the fulfillment has already been accepted. That quiet mental rest is what Neville called the Sabbath. Now, understand this clearly. The Sabbath is not something you force. It appears naturally when the assumption becomes real enough within you that your mind stops asking whether it will happen. The question dissolves because the identity that once doubted the possibility has already been replaced by the identity that accepts it. Let me explain this in a way that might feel familiar to you. Think about a moment when you knew something with absolute certainty. Perhaps you had already signed an agreement, purchased a ticket, or received confirmation that something important was secured. Before that confirmation arrived, your mind may have been restless. You checked your messages repeatedly, wondering if everything would work out. But the moment confirmation came, the tension disappeared. The situation had not yet unfolded physically. You might still have been days or weeks away from the event, but your mind had already relaxed. That relaxation is the psychological signature of the Sabbath. The challenge many people face is that they try to remain in a state of effort even after they have imagined the fulfilled desire. They continue pushing, repeating affirmations with tension, searching constantly for signs in the outer world. But the very act of searching often reveals that the mind has not yet reached the Sabbath. If the assumption were truly accepted, the impulse to check would fade. The Sabbath begins when the inner conversation changes from, "Will this happen?" to, "It is already part of my life." From that moment forward, something subtle begins unfolding in the present moment. The ordinary rhythm of your day continues: work, conversation, small tasks, but the emotional tone beneath those activities changes. Instead of carrying anxiety about the future, you move with a quiet sense of direction. Your attention returns to the present because the future no longer feels uncertain, and this is where the present moment becomes powerful. When your mind is not trapped in worry or anticipation, it becomes far more perceptive. You begin noticing ideas, opportunities, and connections that might have passed unnoticed before. A conversation that once seemed ordinary suddenly reveals new meaning. An idea that arrives during a quiet moment begins opening unexpected possibilities. Life continues moving, but your awareness of it deepens. Many people assume manifestation happens through dramatic events. In reality, it often unfolds through small shifts that gradually reorganize circumstances. One conversation leads to another. One opportunity opens the door to the next. The outer world rearranges itself step by step around the inner state you have accepted. Trust is what allows this process to unfold without resistance. Trust does not mean sitting still or refusing to participate in life. It means acting without the constant tension of trying to control every result. You still make decisions, still take steps forward, but those actions arise from confidence rather than desperation. Instead of forcing life to prove something to you, you allow life to reveal the path already forming beneath your feet. The present moment becomes the stage where this unfolding happens. Think about how differently the day feels when your mind is calm. Simple moments: walking outside, speaking with someone, noticing a quiet detail around you begin to feel more alive. Instead of rushing through time, you experience it more fully. The present stops feeling like an obstacle between you and your desire. It becomes the environment where your new reality is gradually taking shape. This is why the Sabbath is not merely a passive state. It is an alignment between inner certainty and present awareness. When those two meet, the energy of your life shifts. You are no longer divided between imagination and reality. The identity you accepted internally begins expressing itself naturally in how you live each moment. Over time, the outer world reflects that alignment. Opportunities appear that feel almost perfectly timed. Circumstances change in ways that once seemed unlikely. What once felt like coincidence begins looking more like a quiet pattern unfolding. Yet the most important change has already happened long before those events appear. The change happened when you stopped treating fulfillment as something far away. You allowed the present moment to hold the certainty of what you had already accepted within. And from that calm center, life continues unfolding naturally, steadily, and often more gracefully than the anxious mind ever expected, until the reality you once imagined no longer feels extraordinary at all. It simply feels like the life you have been living all along. You do not become a different person in a single dramatic moment. The transformation that truly changes a life rarely arrives like lightning. Instead, it happens in a quieter way, almost unnoticed at first. A new idea about yourself begins to appear. At the beginning, it may feel slightly unfamiliar, even a little fragile. You test it gently inside your mind, wondering if you can truly live from that identity. And yet, the more often you return to that idea, the more familiar it becomes. Eventually, something shifts. What once felt like imagination slowly starts feeling like the most natural version of you. This is what Neville Goddard meant when he spoke about assuming the new self. The word assume here is extremely important. It does not mean pretending in a shallow way. It means stepping mentally and emotionally into the identity of the person you wish to be, and allowing yourself to experience life from that perspective even before external evidence appears. At first, the difference may exist only in your thoughts and reactions, but those small internal changes gradually begin influencing how you move through the world. Let me speak to you directly for a moment. Every day you already live from a certain self-concept. Without thinking about it, you carry assumptions about who you are. Perhaps you see yourself as someone cautious, someone creative, someone easily overwhelmed, or someone capable of solving problems. These identities were formed through repeated experiences and the interpretations you gave them. Over time, the mind accepted them as normal because they feel familiar. You rarely question them. But the remarkable truth is that identity is far more flexible than most people believe. The version of yourself you have been living as is not permanent. It is simply the identity you have practiced long enough for it to feel natural. And if an identity can become natural through repetition, a new identity can become natural in the same way. Imagine someone who has always seen themselves as uncertain in social situations. For years, they may have quietly assumed that they are not particularly confident when speaking with others. Because of that belief, they approach conversations carefully, often waiting for others to lead. Their behavior reinforces the identity they already expect. Yet the moment they begin assuming a different self-image, someone calm, comfortable, and present in conversation, the internal experience begins to change. At first, the difference may feel small, like a subtle adjustment in posture or tone. But over time, that adjustment becomes familiar. Eventually, they notice that they are speaking more easily, responding more naturally, and the old identity begins fading into the background. This is how the practice works. You do not wait for the world to confirm the new self before you accept it. Instead, you begin living from that identity internally until the outer world gradually reflects it. At first, this can feel unusual because the mind has been trained to rely heavily on external evidence. Most people believe they must see results before they can believe in change. The law of assumption reverses that order. You accept the new identity first, not because you have already seen proof, but because you understand that identity shapes the experiences that follow. Think about how habits form in other areas of life. When someone begins learning a new skill, the first attempts often feel awkward. A musician's fingers may move clumsily across the instrument. A new language may sound unfamiliar in the mouth. But repetition slowly builds familiarity. What once required conscious effort becomes automatic. The same process applies to identity. The first time you assume the state of your new self, it may feel slightly artificial. The second time, it becomes easier. Each repetition strengthens the emotional connection to that identity. Gradually, the mind stops resisting it. The assumption becomes part of your normal way of thinking. One of the most powerful aspects of this practice is how it influences your emotional reactions. When you carry the identity of someone fulfilled, situations that once triggered doubt begin affecting you differently. You respond with calm rather than anxiety. Instead of interpreting challenges as threats, you see them as temporary conditions. Your decisions begin reflecting the stability of your new self-concept. This change may seem invisible at first, yet it has profound effects on the direction of your life. The opportunities you recognize, the risks you are willing to take, and the conversations you initiate all begin aligning with the identity you are practicing internally. Now, something interesting begins happening. The line between practice and reality slowly disappears. At the beginning, you may have felt as though you were acting as if you were the person you wished to become. But after enough repetition, the new self no longer feels like an act. It feels authentic. The emotional state becomes familiar. The behaviors associated with it arise naturally. You stop reminding yourself to be that person because you simply are that person. This moment is often quiet and almost surprising. You realize that the identity you once imagined has become the way you move through the world. The confidence you practiced internally shows up in conversations. The creativity you cultivated appears in your work. The peace you imagined becomes part of your daily awareness. From the outside, it may appear as though your life changed gradually through circumstances. But from the inside, you understand something deeper. The change began the moment you started assuming a new version of yourself and continued returning to that assumption until it became natural. Eventually, the outer world simply catches up with the inner transformation. And when that happens, the life you once thought you were creating begins to feel less like a distant achievement and more like the natural expression of who you have quietly become. There is a moment on this path when something important begins to soften inside you. Up to this point, you may have been learning, practicing, imagining, revising, observing your thoughts, and consciously shaping your assumptions. All of that is valuable. It helps you understand how consciousness creates experience. Yet eventually, the practice must mature into something quieter and more natural. Instead of trying to use the law, you begin allowing the law to move through you. At the beginning of this journey, it is very common to treat the law of assumption like a technique. People imagine their desire, repeat affirmations, and monitor their thoughts carefully, hoping they are doing everything correctly. There is nothing wrong with this stage. It helps develop awareness. But if the practice stays at that level for too long, it can become mechanical. The mind keeps asking, "Am I doing this right?" Or "Why hasn't the result appeared yet?" In that state, the law feels like something you must constantly manage. But the deeper realization arrives when you see that the law is not something external you must operate. It is simply the way consciousness already functions. Just as gravity does not require effort to exist, the creative movement of assumption does not require strain. It is always active. The real shift occurs when your identity aligns with the state you have chosen so completely that you begin living from it naturally. This is where embodiment begins. Embodiment means the idea you once practiced internally is no longer just a thought. It has become part of the way you carry yourself through the world. Your posture changes slightly. Your voice carries a steadier tone. The way you make decisions reflects clarity instead of hesitation. People may not know exactly what changed, but they sense it in your presence. Let me bring this closer to you. Imagine someone who has assumed the identity of a confident creator in their own life. At first, that assumption existed only in imagination, but as they continued returning to that identity, it began influencing their daily actions. They spoke about their ideas more openly. They approached opportunities with curiosity instead of doubt. They became more attentive to possibilities around them. Eventually, the identity stopped feeling like practice and started feeling like reality. That is embodiment. When embodiment happens, something remarkable occurs. You stop thinking about the law all the time. Instead of constantly checking your inner state, you simply move through life with the emotional alignment you have cultivated. The law continues operating, but it no longer feels like a method you must apply. Alignment is what allows this shift to happen. Alignment means your thoughts, emotions, and actions are no longer contradicting each other. Earlier in the journey, a person might imagine success while still feeling internally doubtful. They might affirm abundance while secretly assuming scarcity. These inner contradictions slow the process because the mind is sending mixed signals. But when alignment forms, those contradictions fade. Your thoughts begin reflecting the identity you have chosen. Your feelings support that identity. Your actions express it naturally. From that point forward, life becomes less about forcing change and more about allowing change to unfold. Allowing does not mean passivity. It means trusting the direction that emerges from your aligned state. When you feel guided toward an idea, you explore it. When an opportunity appears, you respond with openness. Instead of pushing every situation aggressively, you remain attentive to the subtle movements of life. Many people notice that once they reach this stage, their intuition becomes clearer. Decisions that once felt confusing begin to feel simpler. You do not analyze every possibility endlessly because your inner state already carries a sense of direction. The law is working through you rather than being pushed by you. This also changes how you experience challenges. Earlier in the journey, obstacles might have triggered doubt about whether the process was working. But when embodiment and alignment are present, challenges lose their ability to shake your identity. You recognize them as temporary adjustments rather than contradictions of your path. Think of it like learning to ride a bicycle. At first, you must concentrate on every movement balance, speed, steering. But once your body understands the motion, riding becomes effortless. You are no longer thinking about the mechanics of balance. You are simply moving forward. The same principle applies to living in alignment with the law of assumption. At the beginning, you focus on techniques. Later, the state becomes natural, and life begins flowing through that state without constant attention. Another interesting aspect of embodiment is how it influences the people around you. When your inner state is stable, others often respond differently without knowing why. Conversations become smoother. Opportunities appear in unexpected ways. Situations that once felt difficult start resolving themselves more easily. From the outside, it may look like luck or coincidence. But what is really happening is that the environment is responding to the identity you consistently embody. This is why Neville emphasized being rather than merely wishing. When you embody the state of fulfillment, the law does not need constant reminders. Your presence itself carries the assumption. Every action, every interaction, every decision subtly reflects the identity you have accepted. Over time, the distinction between inner imagination and outer life begins dissolving. The qualities you once practiced internally, confidence, clarity, abundance, peace, start appearing naturally in your experiences. Life stops feeling like something you must control. Instead, it feels like something unfolding through you. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this stage is the simplicity it brings. The complicated mental effort fades away. You return to ordinary moments, walking, speaking, working, but with a quiet awareness that your consciousness and your life are no longer separate processes. They are the same movement expressing itself in two different forms. The law continues operating, just as it always has. The difference now is that you are no longer resisting it or trying to manipulate it. You are aligned with it. And from that alignment, life unfolds with a sense of coherence that once felt impossible until the moment you began allowing the creative power within you to move freely through the person you have chosen to become. Step into any room and notice something subtle that most people overlook. Before anyone speaks, before introductions happen, before a single word is exchanged, something else is already communicating. You can feel it in the atmosphere. One person enters, and the space feels calm. Another enters, and the room becomes slightly tense. Someone else arrives, and suddenly people become more attentive, as if the environment itself has shifted. Nothing visible has happened yet, and still something has been transmitted. What you are sensing in those moments is presence, the quiet influence of identity expressed without words. Every human being carries this invisible influence. It is not created by volume, status, or performance. It comes from the inner state a person consistently inhabits. When someone has spent time assuming a new self, aligning their thoughts, emotions, and identity, that inner alignment begins expressing itself outwardly. They do not need to convince others of who they are becoming. Their presence communicates it naturally. This is what we mean when we speak about magnetic identity. A magnetic identity is not built by trying to impress the world. It forms when a person's internal assumption about themselves becomes so stable that it quietly shapes every movement they make. The way they stand, the way they listen, the way they respond to uncertainty, all of it reflects the identity they have accepted within. Because that identity is stable, others can feel it, even if they cannot explain why. Let me bring this closer to you. Imagine someone who has truly accepted the identity of a calm and capable individual. When challenges appear, they do not react with immediate panic. Their breathing stays steady. Their thoughts move clearly, even when they do not yet know the solution. Their demeanor suggests that one will emerge. People around them sense this steadiness. Conversations become more focused. Others begin trusting their judgment. Notice that the influence did not come from persuasive words. It came from embodied certainty. Many people attempt to influence the world through forceful communication. They try to convince, argue, and explain their value repeatedly. But influence that arises from insecurity often feels strained. Others sense the tension beneath the words. On the other hand, when identity is internally secure, influence becomes quieter. A single sentence carries more weight because it emerges from a stable center. This is why Neville often emphasized the power of being rather than the effort of convincing. When you consistently live from the identity you have assumed, you do not need to broadcast it loudly. The world responds to the emotional atmosphere you bring into each interaction. Think about the difference between someone who constantly seeks approval and someone who already feels internally validated. The first person may speak more, explain more, and attempt to control how they are perceived. The second person moves with simplicity. They express their ideas when needed and remain silent when words are unnecessary. That quiet confidence often attracts attention naturally because it reflects internal coherence. Magnetism grows from coherence. When your thoughts, feelings, and actions align with the identity you have chosen, your presence becomes stable. Other people instinctively respond to stability because it provides a sense of psychological safety. Even in uncertain environments, a grounded individual creates a field of calm around them. This field influences conversations, decisions, and relationships in ways that are difficult to measure but easy to feel. This is the power of silent influence. Silent influence does not rely on constant explanation. It operates through emotional transmission. Human beings are deeply responsive to subtle signals, tone of voice, posture, rhythm of speech, eye contact. These signals communicate the inner state more clearly than any carefully chosen sentence. When your identity is aligned internally, those signals naturally reflect the state you are living from. Now consider how this affects your daily interactions. Suppose you enter a conversation already assuming that your ideas carry value. Your posture becomes relaxed. Your listening becomes more attentive because you are not busy defending yourself internally. When you speak, your voice carries calm clarity rather than urgency. The people listening may not consciously analyze these changes, but they respond to them. The conversation unfolds differently simply because your internal state set a different emotional tone. This influence extends beyond individual interactions. Over time, a magnetic identity begins shaping the opportunities and relationships that appear in your life. People who resonate with your state feel naturally drawn toward you. Collaborations arise more easily because others sense the clarity of your direction. Even situations that once felt resistant begin responding differently because the person approaching them is no longer the same. It is important to understand that magnetism is not manipulation. It is not about controlling how others behave. It is about expressing an identity so clearly that it naturally influences the emotional field around you. Just as a steady flame changes the darkness of a room without effort, a stable identity changes the atmosphere of the environments you enter. As you continue practicing the assumption of your new self, this magnetic quality strengthens gradually. At first, you may notice small changes, people listening more carefully, conversations feeling smoother, opportunities appearing where they once seemed scarce. With time, these shifts accumulate. Your life begins reflecting the influence of the identity you embody. The most interesting part of this transformation is how natural it eventually feels. The magnetism you once practiced becomes part of your normal presence. You stop thinking about how you are perceived because your attention is centered on living authentically from your chosen identity. From that place, influence flows without effort. Your words carry weight when you speak. Your silence carries meaning when you pause. Your presence alone begins shaping the environment around you. And through that quiet, embodied presence, the law you once studied as an idea becomes something far more powerful, a living influence moving through the way you exist in the world each day. Let me tell you something that most people never realize until very late in life. The greatest obstacle standing between you and the life you desire is not the world outside you. It is the version of yourself you have been unconsciously carrying for years. That older identity, the one shaped by past disappointments, inherited beliefs, and repeated emotional patterns, quietly continues, operating in the background long after you have decided you want something different. And unless you deliberately release that old self, it will continue recreating the same experiences again and again, no matter how much effort you make to change your circumstances. Now, listen carefully to what I am saying to you. The old self is not something physical. It is not a fixed personality written into your nature. It is simply a collection of assumptions that have been repeated so often that they began to feel like truth. Perhaps somewhere along the way you accepted the idea that success is difficult, that recognition is rare, that opportunities belong to others more than to you. Maybe you adopted the belief that life requires constant struggle, or that happiness must be postponed until everything is perfect. These assumptions may have been formed quietly, through childhood experiences, through things you heard from authority figures, through moments when life seemed to confirm your fears. But here is the astonishing realization. Those assumptions only continued shaping your life because you continued identifying with them. The moment you begin withdrawing your identification from the old self, its authority begins dissolving. Imagine a stage actor who has played the same role for many years. Night after night, the audience sees the same character, the same voice, the same gestures, the same personality. Eventually, even the actor begins feeling identified with the role. Yet when the performance ends and the costume is removed, the actor remembers something simple. The character was never the true self. It was only a role that had been practiced long enough to feel natural. In the same way, the identity you have been living as is not your permanent nature. It is simply the role you have rehearsed through repeated assumptions. Now this is where the real transformation begins. Releasing the old self does not mean fighting it. Many people attempt to change themselves by arguing with their past or trying to eliminate every negative thought. But struggle only strengthens the identity you are trying to escape. The deeper approach is far simpler. You quietly stop feeding energy to the old story. When an old reaction appears, fear, doubt, hesitation, you recognize it as an echo of a previous identity rather than evidence of reality. Instead of obeying that reaction automatically, you pause and return to the state of the person you have chosen to become. You remind yourself internally, that was the old self. I no longer live from that state. At first, this practice requires awareness. Old patterns may appear frequently because the mind has repeated them for years. But each time you refuse to identify with them, their influence weakens. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new center of identity begins forming within you, and this is where something powerful emerges: quiet certainty. Quiet certainty is very different from loud confidence. Loud confidence often tries to prove itself. Quiet certainty simply knows. It does not argue with the world because it no longer needs validation from the world. It rests in the understanding that consciousness itself is the creative authority behind every experience. Let me speak to you directly here. When you reach this state, you stop reacting to life as though it is something happening to you. Instead, you begin moving through life as someone who understands that your inner state precedes every external event. Situations no longer feel random or overwhelming. They appear as reflections of assumptions that can be adjusted whenever necessary. From this perspective, commanding reality does not mean forcing circumstances through effort or control. It means choosing your state of consciousness deliberately and remaining faithful to that state long enough for reality to reorganize around it. Suppose a challenge appears in your environment. The old self might have reacted with worry, immediately imagining failure or limitation. But the new self responds differently. Instead of collapsing into doubt, you hold the assumption that the solution already exists. You move forward calmly, knowing that the state you occupy will eventually shape the outcome. This calm command is incredibly powerful because it does not waste energy resisting appearances. It simply maintains the inner conviction that reality must eventually align with the identity you embody. Over time, people around you begin noticing the difference. They may not understand the internal process you have gone through, but they recognize the steadiness in your reactions. Situations that once seemed stressful no longer disturb you in the same way. Decisions that once required endless hesitation now arise naturally. Even the rhythm of your life begins changing because the person moving through it is no longer the same. You have released the old self, and when the old self fades, the authority of your consciousness becomes unmistakably clear. You realize that reality responds not to effort alone, but to identity, to the state you consistently inhabit. From that realization, your relationship with life becomes simpler and far more powerful. You no longer chase outcomes desperately. You embody the identity from which those outcomes naturally arise. You no longer argue with circumstances. You adjust the state from which you perceive them. You no longer fear the future. You understand that the future grows from the assumptions you hold in the present. This is the quiet command Neville spoke about. It is not dramatic, and it does not require constant demonstration. It is the steady recognition that the creative power shaping your life has always existed within your own awareness. And once you begin living from that understanding, the life unfolding around you gradually starts reflecting the calm authority of the person you have chosen to become. Let me ask you something quietly, not as a philosophical question, but as something worth feeling for a moment inside yourself. How often have you looked outward for the turning point of your life? How many times have you thought the breakthrough would arrive through the right opportunity, the right person, the right conversation, or the right moment of luck appearing somewhere in the future? Almost everyone has lived that way at some point, watching the horizon of life as though the answer must eventually come walking toward them from the outside. But sooner or later, something begins to shift in your understanding. It may come gradually through reflection, or suddenly through a moment of clarity. But the realization feels unmistakable when it appears. The life you are experiencing is not being delivered to you from the outside world. It is unfolding from the state of consciousness you inhabit within. This is what it means to live from within. Most people spend years reacting to the visible surface of life. They respond to circumstances as if those circumstances are fixed realities, determining what is possible. If events appear favorable, they feel hopeful. If situations seem difficult, they feel discouraged. In this pattern, the outer world becomes the authority, and the inner life becomes a reaction to whatever happens externally. But when you begin living from within, that relationship reverses. You no longer treat appearances as final truth. Instead, you understand them as reflections of the states you have previously occupied. The creative movement begins in consciousness first, long before it appears as an event, a conversation, or an opportunity. Now listen carefully to this idea, because it changes the entire way you move through life. When you live from within, you do not wait for reality to convince you that something is possible. You assume the state in which it is already natural, and then you allow life to reorganize around that assumption. That is why Neville often spoke about assuming miracles. Un miracle, in the way he described it, is not a violation of natural law. It is the natural outcome of a shift in consciousness that appears surprising only because the world did not see the internal change that preceded it. What people call a miracle is often simply the delayed visibility of an inner assumption finally expressing itself. Think about moments in your life when something unexpected worked out perfectly, when the right person appeared at the right time, when an opportunity emerged from a place you had not even considered, when a solution arrived in a way that felt almost orchestrated. To the logical mind, these events may appear coincidental, but from the perspective of consciousness, they often reflect a deeper alignment between your inner state and the unfolding of life around you. When you begin living from within, these moments become more familiar. This does not mean life becomes a series of constant dramatic events. In fact, the change is usually quieter than people expect. What transforms is your relationship with possibility. Instead of seeing the world as a collection of rigid limitations, you begin seeing it as something fluid, something responsive to the identity you occupy internally. Let me bring this closer to you. Imagine a person who has spent years believing that opportunities are rare and difficult to reach. That belief quietly influences the way they interpret every situation. When a possibility appears, they hesitate. When something unexpected happens, they assume it will probably not last. Their assumptions filter reality, reinforcing the belief they already carry. Now imagine that same person gradually adopting a different assumption, that life is responsive, that opportunities appear in ways the mind cannot always predict, that solutions often arrive through channels we did not anticipate. When that new assumption becomes natural, their attention begins shifting. They notice possibilities they once overlooked. They respond to situations with curiosity instead of caution. Their actions change because their inner interpretation of reality has changed. From the outside, it may appear as though life suddenly became more generous toward them. Yet the deeper truth is that their state of consciousness opened them to experiences that were always possible. This is why assuming miracles is not about fantasy or denial of reality. It is about recognizing that reality is far more flexible than the human mind usually believes. The visible world often rearranges itself in response to the assumptions held consistently within consciousness. And here is where the journey becomes deeply personal. As you continue living from within, a surprising realization begins forming quietly inside you. For much of your life, you may have believed that the answer to your circumstances would eventually arrive through something external, through someone rescuing you, through perfect timing, through a breakthrough coming from the outside world. But the more you observe the relationship between your inner state and your experiences, the clearer something becomes. You were never waiting for the answer. You were always the source from which the answer emerges. Your awareness, your assumptions, your imagination. These are not passive observers of reality. They are the creative center from which reality unfolds. The moment you accept this deeply, the search for external salvation begins fading. Life becomes less about chasing solutions and more about embodying the state from which solutions naturally appear. That realization changes how you move through every situation. Instead of asking, "Who will fix this?" you ask, "What state of consciousness would naturally resolve this?" Instead of wondering, "Where will the opportunity come from?" you assume the identity of someone for whom opportunities appear. Instead of waiting for proof that life supports you, you begin living from the quiet understanding that the creative power shaping your life has always existed within your own awareness. And from that perspective, miracles stop feeling extraordinary. They become the natural language through which consciousness expresses itself when you consistently live from the identity you have chosen to embody. Life continues unfolding moment by moment, just as it always has. Yet the way you experience it changes profoundly. The world is no longer a place where you search endlessly for the missing answer. It becomes the stage upon which the answer you already are gradually reveals itself through the experiences of your own life. Look back for a moment, not to analyze every step you have taken, but simply to notice how far your understanding has moved. When this journey began, the law of assumption may have sounded like an interesting idea, perhaps even a mysterious one. It suggested that your inner world was not merely reacting to life, but quietly shaping it. At first, that thought may have felt almost too simple, yet the more you explored it, the more you began seeing its fingerprints everywhere in your reactions, in your expectations, in the subtle relationship between what you assume and what eventually unfolds around you. Now something deeper begins to reveal itself. The purpose of understanding this law was never only to change circumstances. Yes, external results often shift as your assumptions change. Opportunities appear. Relationships transform. Obstacles dissolve. New paths open. But those outer adjustments are only the visible surface of a much larger transformation. The real change happens in the way you experience yourself. You stop seeing yourself as someone waiting for life to cooperate. You begin recognizing yourself as someone participating directly in the creative movement of reality. This is where the final stage of the journey begins, not the end of growth, but the beginning of living consciously with the understanding you have gained. Neville often described this stage as becoming a living witness to the law. In other words, you no longer talk about the law of assumption as a theory. Your life itself becomes the evidence. Now listen closely to what that means. Being living proof of the law does not require constant demonstration or dramatic events. It does not mean walking through life trying to prove something to others. In fact, the deeper expression of this understanding is surprisingly quiet. It appears in the calm confidence with which you move through situations. It appears in the way you interpret challenges without collapsing into fear. It appears in the steady trust that the inner state you cultivate will eventually express itself outwardly. You carry the light of this understanding not through loud declarations, but through the consistency of your inner life. Imagine someone who truly knows that their assumptions shape their experience. When circumstances become uncertain, They do not panic immediately. Instead, they return to the state they wish to live from. They adjust the inner story quietly. They imagine the outcome they prefer and allow their identity to settle into that state. From the outside, it may appear as though they simply remained calm during a difficult moment, but internally something powerful has occurred. They have chosen their state rather than surrendering it to appearances. This quiet discipline gradually transforms how life responds to them. Over time, people begin noticing something different about the way you move through the world. They may not know the language of assumption or consciousness, but they sense the steadiness in your presence. When others react with anxiety, you remain thoughtful. When others rush toward conclusions, you pause long enough to see a different possibility. In conversations, your words carry clarity because they come from a centered identity rather than a reactive one. This is how the law begins shining through a human life, not through perfection, but through awareness. You will still experience ordinary human moments, questions, adjustments, learning, even occasional uncertainty. But the difference now is that you understand where to return. You know that the creative center of your life is not somewhere outside you. It is the state of consciousness you occupy right now. That understanding becomes your quiet foundation, and something beautiful happens when you begin living from that foundation consistently. You stop trying to control every outcome. Instead, you cultivate the inner state that naturally produces the kind of life you wish to experience. The world begins responding to that state in ways both subtle and surprising. Some events unfold exactly as imagined. Others arrive through unexpected pathways you never predicted. Yet beneath all of it runs the same recognition. Consciousness precedes experience. This realization also changes how you relate to other people. Instead of judging their reactions or trying to fix their circumstances, you begin seeing them with greater compassion. You recognize that everyone is living from the assumptions they have accepted. Whether consciously or unconsciously, some are still reacting to the surface of life, believing circumstances define them. Others are beginning to question those appearances, sensing that something deeper may be operating beneath them. Your role is not to convince anyone of anything. Your role is simply to live from the awareness you have discovered. When someone encounters a person who quietly embodies clarity, calmness, and trust, something subtle happens. It reminds them that another way of experiencing life may be possible. Sometimes that reminder appears through a conversation. Sometimes it appears simply through the atmosphere of your presence. Either way, the light you carry becomes visible not through explanation, but through example, and that is the quiet power of becoming living proof. You move through ordinary days working, speaking, making decisions, meeting people, but the consciousness behind those actions has changed. You are no longer reacting blindly to circumstances. You are participating in the unfolding of reality with awareness of the law that connects inner assumption to outer experience. Over time, the practice becomes less like a technique and more like a natural orientation toward life. You return to your inner state again and again, not because you are forcing change, but because you understand that identity shapes the world you encounter. And so the journey continues not as a search for something missing, but as a deepening recognition of what has always been present within you. You carry the light of this understanding into every new moment, not as a doctrine, not as a performance, but as a quiet, steady awareness that the life unfolding around you is inseparably connected to the consciousness through which you experience it.